Good afternoon. I'm J. Lenora Bressler, and welcome to the Holy Week 2019. This is the April 17th, 2019 edition of the Bible Delight in the Details. When most of us are reading the gospel accounts, I think we have a tendency to skip directly from the triumphal entry of Palm Sunday, which we discussed on our last program, to the events of what we would call Maundy Thursday, the evening of Thursday night, being the Passover Seder, followed, of course, by the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ's arrest, followed by the crucifixion on Good Friday. But we overlook the significance of Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. As we discussed in our last program, on Sunday, that was known as the Day of Selection. And the Passover lamb, who was thought to be blameless and innocent and perfect, would have been brought in by the high priest, paraded through the streets of Jerusalem, and then he would have been tied to a post in the courtyard of the temple, so that during the 4 days leading up to Passover, which would fall on what we would call Good Friday, the people who went in and out of the temple area, which would have been tens of thousands of people during this important week leading up to Passover, they would have been able to observe this lamb and be sure that it was indeed perfect. Just like the little animal lamb, Jesus did the same thing. He followed the high priest's procession through the streets as the Lamb of God. People are calling out the exact same thing that they're calling out as the animal lamb is preceded into the temple. And then we're told that Jesus went straight into the temple on that Sunday. Now, all of the Gospels are clear. You may have to pay attention to what you're reading. Mark is probably the clearest about exactly what happened when during the time from Sunday into Thursday of Holy Week. Fascinatingly, we are told that Jesus went into the temple, as did the Lamb, on that day of selection. But then we're told that he left. He went outside of the city and stayed in Bethany for the evening of Sunday. But then he was back in the temple, and he was teaching for the next several days in the temple. And he was telling parables. And it is very clear that all of these parables, or almost all of them, have a similar message. And that is bringing condemnation on the Jewish religious leaders. And the Gospels make no bones about it and say straight out that the Pharisees and the Sadducees understood what he was saying, and they hated him because they recognized that the parables were about them. Were about them. Now, this is absolutely fascinating because it also dovetails with other things that are happening. Mark makes it clear that it is the night of Monday when Jesus once again is leaving the temple after a full day of teaching. He is going back to Bethany, and on the way he sees a fig tree. Now, the fig tree is a very important plant in the Jerusalem area, in the Holy Land. It has very broad shade. It provides food for people and shade. It's a very important tree. There are two harvests for the figs. The first comes in late spring, when this would have been. Passover comes in late spring. And it would have had very small fruit. But the fruit... fig trees are very bountiful, and they have very, very large leaves. So you can see this tree from afar, and you can see when it's nice and filled out. And in the spring, if there are leaves, then there should be the first of the fruiting. There'll be a later one later in the summer. However, if for some reason there's no fruit when the leaves are nice and full, that indicates that there's something wrong with the tree, and the tree will not have the second fruit either. Jesus, you may remember, curses the fig tree. And then Mark tells us that the next day, when they're going back into Jerusalem and Jesus is going back into the temple to teach, that fig tree is completely withered up. And it's remarked on by the disciples. Now, what is this whole thing about this fig tree? The fig tree, just like the parables that Jesus is in the temple at this time teaching about, represents the Jewish religious leaders. They are supposed to be just like that fig tree, a source of succor, of sustenance, of life for Israel. And yet they were not. Oh, they had the trappings. They were claiming to have the words of life. But when you went up to it and went to them for that, they were doing just the opposite. They were putting man-made rules on people. They were hypocrites. They were burdening the people. And all of the parables that Jesus is in the temple teaching are making that very, very clear. And Jesus is cursing this, saying, that the Jewish religious leaders of that time are not being fruitful, and nor are they going to be. So he is at that point, scholars believe this is the time when there is a removal of the primary ambassadorship, if you will, of God is being moved from the Jewish hierarchy, religious leaders, to other people. And ultimately, those other people will form the church. It is fascinating when you read these parables and you see how many of them Jesus is calling a contrast to the religious leaders who are hypocrites, who are unhelpful, and yet he's pointing to certain people in the temple, like the woman that gave all she had to the collection plate, as being the devout, the true believers. Now, it's very fascinating. One last thing. In all of this negativity about the Jewish leaders, Christ knows that after his resurrection, many of those priests are going to become members of the early church. They are going to see the light. And he tells a parable about that I believe is directed to those people. Because if you are a priest who at the time is thinking, oh, I don't know about this Jesus dude, I really don't know, and then later you come to him, you might remember all those parables, remember the cursing of the fig tree, and wonder if you can come to him after not having faith in him. And one of the parables he tells is the story of two brothers, and the father of them asked them to do something. And one brother said, yes, I'll do it, but he doesn't. And the other one says, no, but he eventually does. And obviously, when he asks the audience, and who did the will of the Father, they say, well, the one who actually did the right thing, even if he did it late. And I think, frankly, I believe he was speaking to those particularly Jewish leaders who at that time were either not sure or were against him, but who later would see the light and become one of the many Jewish leaders that would eventually come into the church in those early days. I think they would remember that parable, that it's never too late to do the right thing. I'm J. Lenora Bressler. Visit me for the next edition on this Holy Week of the Bible. Delight in the details. Have a great, great evening.